In a world obsessed with positivity and endless compassion, there exists a truth so uncomfortable that most people spend their entire lives running from it. Your kindness, when misdirected and unconditional, is not making you a better person. It's making you a weaker one. Right now, in boardrooms and coffee shops, in relationships and family dynamics, millions of genuinely good people are being systematically exploited, manipulated, and diminished precisely because they've been taught that kindness is always virtuous, always appropriate, always the higher path. The research on this phenomenon is stark and undeniable. A comprehensive study published in the Journal of Applied Psychology followed 1,200 professionals over 5 years and found that individuals who scored highest on agreeableness and unconditional positive regard were 73% more likely to be passed over for promotions, 68% more likely to have their ideas stolen without credit, and 81% more likely to report feeling chronically overwhelmed by others' demands on their time and energy. But here's what makes this truly tragic. These weren't weak people. They weren't lacking in talent, intelligence, or capability. They were simply operating under a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of human interaction, a misunderstanding that our culture has not only perpetuated but elevated to the status of moral superiority. The uncomfortable truth that most self-help gurus and motivational speakers won't tell you is this: in a world where some people operate with genuine malice, manipulation, and self-serving calculation, your unconditional kindness doesn't elevate the discourse. It makes you pray. When you refuse to acknowledge the darker aspects of human nature, when you insist on seeing the best in everyone regardless of their demonstrated behavior, you're not being enlightened. You're being naive in a way that consistently works against your own interests and, paradoxically, against your ability to help others effectively. If you're serious about building habits that create genuine strength and long-term success, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We explore the uncomfortable truths about human psychology that most people prefer to ignore. Now, before we dive deeper, we need to distinguish between two fundamentally different concepts that our culture has unfortunately conflated: kindness and weakness. True kindness, what the ancient philosophers would have recognized as genuine virtue, is rooted in strength, discernment, and wisdom. It's the ability to help others from a position of authentic power and security. Weakness disguised as kindness, on the other hand, is people-pleasing behavior driven by fear, insecurity, and a desperate need for approval. When you can't say no to unreasonable requests, when you consistently prioritize others' comfort over your own legitimate needs, when you find yourself repeatedly taken advantage of by the same people, you're not demonstrating kindness. You're demonstrating what psychologists call pathological altruism. This is a pattern of behavior that masquerades as virtue but actually stems from deep-seated fears about rejection, abandonment, and social disapproval. The philosopher who understood this distinction most clearly lived 5 centuries ago in the political chaos of Renaissance Italy. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing during an era when kingdoms rose and fell based on the strength or weakness of their leaders, observed something crucial about human nature that remains just as relevant today. Those who are unconditionally generous and trusting in their dealings with others will consistently be defeated by those who understand when to be kind and when to be firm. Machiavelli wrote, "Since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved." This wasn't the advice of a cruel man. It was the observation of someone who had witnessed countless good people destroyed by their inability to recognize when kindness becomes counterproductive. Consider what happens in your own life when you operate from unconditional kindness. You say yes to requests that stretch you beyond your capacity because you don't want to disappoint anyone. You lend money to people who have never paid you back because you don't want to seem selfish. You tolerate disrespectful behavior from colleagues, friends, or family members because you've been taught that setting boundaries is somehow unkind. Meanwhile, the people who are willing to prioritize their own interests, who can say no without guilt, who refuse to be taken advantage of, consistently achieve better outcomes. They're not necessarily less caring or less moral. They simply understand that strength and kindness are not mutually exclusive, and that sustainable help for others requires maintaining your own position of stability and power. This dynamic plays out with devastating consistency in professional environments. The employee who stays late to help everyone else with their projects while their own work suffers. The manager who can't give negative feedback because they don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, watching their team's performance deteriorate as a result. The entrepreneur who undercharges for their services because asking for fair compensation feels greedy, slowly driving their business toward failure. In each case, the underlying pattern is the same: a fundamental misunderstanding about what genuine service to others actually requires. You cannot help people effectively from a position of weakness. You cannot contribute meaningfully to the world when you're constantly being drained by those who mistake your kindness for availability, your generosity for obligation, your compassion for vulnerability. The research in organizational psychology is unambiguous on this point. Leaders who are perceived as too nice consistently struggle to implement necessary changes, enforce important standards, and make difficult decisions that serve the greater good. Their kindness, rather than creating better outcomes for everyone, creates environments where mediocrity is tolerated, accountability is absent, and genuinely harmful behavior goes unchecked. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of unconditional kindness is how it prevents you from developing the very qualities that would make your kindness more effective. When you're afraid to disappoint anyone, you never develop the skill of strategic decision-making. When you're unwilling to risk conflict, you never learn how to have difficult conversations that could actually solve problems. When you consistently prioritize others' immediate comfort over long-term outcomes, you never develop the wisdom to distinguish between helping and enabling. The tragic irony is that people who are unconditionally kind often cause more harm than those who are selectively kind. The parent who never sets firm boundaries with their children, claiming they don't want to be the bad guy, raises children who struggle with self-discipline and respect for authority. The friend who always provides a sympathetic ear but never offers honest feedback enables destructive patterns rather than promoting growth. The leader who avoids making unpopular decisions creates organizational chaos that ultimately hurts everyone involved. This isn't an argument for cruelty or selfishness. It's an argument for what Machiavelli called virtuous pragmatism, the wisdom to recognize that true kindness sometimes requires actions that feel unkind in the moment but serve everyone's interests in the long run. It's the understanding that strength and compassion are not opposites but partners, and that the ability to be appropriately firm is what makes authentic kindness possible. Consider the surgeon who must cause pain to heal, the teacher who must challenge students to help them grow, the parent who must enforce consequences to develop character. In each case, what appears harsh in the moment serves a deeper kindness, a kindness that prioritizes long-term well-being over immediate comfort, genuine growth over superficial harmony. The question we must ask ourselves is this: have we confused being liked with being respected? Have we mistaken others' approval for genuine moral worth? Have we convinced ourselves that our inability to set boundaries, make difficult decisions, and prioritize our own legitimate needs is somehow evidence of superior character? As we prepare to explore exactly how this pattern develops and why it's so persistent, I want you to consider your own relationship with kindness. Are you kind from a position of strength, choosing when and how to help others based on wisdom and discernment? Or are you kind from a position of fear, desperately trying to earn approval and avoid conflict regardless of the cost to yourself and, ultimately, to those you claim to care about. Because the path forward isn't about becoming cruel or selfish, it's about becoming strong enough to be genuinely kind in ways that actually serve the world rather than simply making you feel good about yourself in the moment. To understand why unconditional kindness weakens us, we need to examine the psychological mechanisms that make this pattern so seductive and so persistent. Because here's what most people miss. The compulsion to be universally kind isn't actually about caring for others. It's about managing our own anxiety, insecurity, and fear of social rejection. We've learned to use virtue as a shield against the fundamental uncertainty of human relationships, and in doing so, we've perverted virtue into a form of sophisticated self-protection. Dr. Harriet Braker's groundbreaking research on what she termed disease to please revealed that people who cannot set appropriate boundaries with others are operating from what psychologists call an external locus of control. Their sense of worth, safety, and identity depends entirely on others' approval and acceptance. The kindness isn't flowing from genuine abundance, it's flowing from a desperate attempt to control how others perceive and treat them. This creates what researchers call a double bind. The more you need others' approval, the more you'll sacrifice your own interests to get it. But the more you sacrifice your own interests, the less others respect you. The less others respect you, the more insecure you become. The more insecure you become, the more desperately you need their approval. You're trapped in a psychological spiral that makes you weaker with each iteration, all while convincing yourself that you're demonstrating superior moral character. Machiavelli observed this pattern in the political leaders of his era, noting that those who tried to be loved by everyone ended up being respected by no one. He wrote, "Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see and few can feel. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few really know what you are." The leaders who tried to please all constituencies consistently lost power to those who were willing to make difficult decisions that served their genuine objectives. But in our personal lives, this dynamic operates even more subtly and destructively. Consider how weaponized virtue manifests in everyday interactions. You're asked to work late on a Friday to help a colleague who consistently poor planning creates emergencies. Your immediate impulse is to say no, you have plans, you've already worked extra hours this week, and this person's pattern of crisis management isn't your responsibility. But then your internal narrative kicks in. A good person would help. I don't want to seem selfish. What if they think I'm not a team player? What if this affects how they treat me in the future? So you say yes, cancel your plans, and work late. Meanwhile, your colleague learns that their poor planning can be remediated by your willingness to sacrifice, ensuring that this pattern will continue and probably escalate. You've used your kindness to avoid the discomfort of potential disapproval, but you've also reinforced a dynamic that serves no one's long-term interests. Your colleague doesn't develop better planning skills, your own work-life balance deteriorates, and you've established yourself as someone whose boundaries can be violated without consequence. This is what makes weaponized virtue so insidious. It feels noble while actually being cowardly. You're not helping your colleague become more responsible. You're enabling their irresponsibility because confronting it would require you to risk their momentary displeasure. You're not being kind. You're being conflict avoidant in a way that makes future problems more likely and more severe. The neuroscience behind this pattern is fascinating and revealing. When we engage in people-pleasing behavior, our brains release small amounts of dopamine and serotonin, the same neurotransmitters associated with addiction. We literally become addicted to others' approval, and like any addiction, we need increasingly larger doses to achieve the same psychological relief. Dr. Martha Beck's research on codependency shows that people trapped in this pattern often develop what she calls approval addiction withdrawal when they try to set boundaries. They experience genuine anxiety, guilt, and even physical discomfort when they consider saying no to unreasonable requests. Their nervous systems have learned to associate others' displeasure with existential threat, making boundary setting feel dangerous even when it's obviously necessary. This explains why intelligent, capable people continue patterns of behavior that consistently work against their interests. Their rational mind knows that saying no would be appropriate, but their nervous system interprets saying no as risking abandonment, rejection, or social exile. The fear operates at a primal level that overrides logical analysis. Meanwhile, people who have learned to prioritize their own legitimate needs don't experience this internal conflict. They can be genuinely helpful when it's appropriate and genuinely firm when firmness serves everyone's interests. They're not constantly calculating how their actions will affect others' opinions of them because their sense of worth comes from internal rather than external sources. This difference in psychological foundation creates dramatically different life outcomes. People who operate from internal validation can take calculated risks, make unpopular but necessary decisions, and invest their energy in activities that align with their genuine values and long-term objectives. People who operate from external validation are constantly reacting to others' needs, expectations, and manipulations, leaving little energy for their own growth and development. Machiavelli understood this distinction when he wrote about the difference between those who depend on fortune and those who depend on their own virtue and preparation. Those who depend on others' approval are at the mercy of forces beyond their control, while those who depend on their own principles and capabilities can navigate uncertainty with confidence and effectiveness. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of weaponized virtue is how it affects your ability to help others authentically. When your kindness comes from fear rather than strength, you can't actually assess what would genuinely serve another person's growth and development. You're too invested in avoiding their negative reaction to risk giving them feedback they need to hear, setting boundaries they need to encounter, or refusing to enable patterns that are ultimately destructive. Consider the parent who can't set firm rules because they want their children to like them. The short-term result is children who seem happy and compliant. The long-term result is children who never develop internal discipline, respect for authority, or the ability to delay gratification. The parent's need to be liked prevents them from providing the structure and guidance that genuine love requires. Or consider the manager who can't give honest performance reviews because they don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. The immediate result is employees who feel good about their interactions with their boss. The eventual result is a department where standards deteriorate, good performers become resentful, and poor performers never get the feedback they need to improve. In both cases, what appears kind in the moment is actually cruel in its long-term consequences. True kindness requires the strength to risk others' momentary displeasure in service of their genuine growth and development. It requires the wisdom to distinguish between what people want and what they actually need. This is why Machiavelli argued that effective leaders must be willing to be temporarily disliked in order to serve the greater good. He wasn't advocating for cruelty. He was recognizing that genuine care for others sometimes requires actions that feel harsh in the moment but serve everyone's interests over time. The psychological research supports this insight completely. Studies show that children raised by parents who set clear, consistent boundaries report higher levels of security and self-esteem as adults than children raised by permissive parents who avoided conflict. Employees who receive honest feedback, even when it's initially uncomfortable, show greater improvement and job satisfaction than those who receive only positive reinforcement. Yet most people continue to confuse enabling with kindness, conflict avoidance with compassion, and people-pleasing with virtue. They've weaponized their own goodness against themselves, using it to justify patterns of behavior that consistently weaken their position and undermine their ability to contribute meaningfully to others' lives. The question we need to ask ourselves is this: are we kind because we're strong enough to choose kindness wisely, or are we kind because we're too weak to risk being anything else? Are we helping others from a position of genuine care and abundance, or are we helping them to manage our own anxiety about their opinion of us? As we move into understanding how to transform this pattern, remember that the goal isn't to become harsh or selfish. The goal is to become strong enough to be authentically kind in ways that actually serve others rather than simply protecting ourselves from the discomfort of their potential disapproval. The path forward isn't about abandoning kindness. It's about elevating it from an unconscious compulsion to a conscious choice. What Machiavelli understood, and what modern psychology has confirmed, is that the most effective and genuinely helpful people are those who have learned what we might call strategic compassion, the ability to be kind when kindness serves everyone's highest interests, and firm when firmness is what the situation actually requires. This requires developing what researchers call emotional intelligence, combined with what philosophers call practical wisdom. You need the ability to read situations accurately, understand the likely consequences of different responses, and choose your actions based on long-term outcomes rather than immediate comfort. This is infinitely more sophisticated than either universal kindness or universal toughness. It requires judgment, courage, and a genuine commitment to what serves the greater good rather than what feels easiest in the moment. Dr. Daniel Goleman's research on emotional intelligence reveals that the most successful leaders, parents, and partners are those who can modulate their responses based on what each specific situation requires. They're not consistently soft or consistently hard, they're consistently wise. They understand that true strength lies not in having one response to all situations, but in having the full range of human responses available and the wisdom to know which one serves everyone best. Machiavelli illustrated this principle through his famous metaphor of the lion and the fox. He wrote, "A prince ought to be both a fox and a lion, because a lion cannot defend himself against snares and a fox cannot defend himself against wolves. Therefore, it is necessary to be a fox to discover the snares and a lion to terrify the wolves." In modern terms, this means you need both the intelligence to recognize when someone is trying to manipulate or take advantage of you, the fox, and the strength to respond appropriately when such recognition occurs, the lion. Most people who struggle with boundaries have developed neither capability. They can't read manipulative behavior accurately, and even when they do recognize it, they lack the inner strength to respond effectively. The first element of strategic compassion is developing what psychologists call manipulation detection. This isn't about becoming paranoid or cynical. It's about becoming realistic about the full spectrum of human behavior. Some people will approach you with genuine needs and honest intentions. Others will approach you with entitled demands and manipulative strategies. Your response should be calibrated to what you're actually dealing with, not what you hope you're dealing with. Research shows that manipulative individuals consistently target people who demonstrate unconditional kindness because they've learned that such people can be reliably exploited. They're not necessarily conscious of this process. Many manipulators have convinced themselves that their behavior is justified by their needs or circumstances. But the pattern remains consistent. They seek out people who are afraid to say no, who feel guilty about prioritizing their own needs, who can be made to feel selfish for setting reasonable boundaries. The key insight is this: by being unconditionally kind, you're not just making yourself vulnerable to exploitation. You're actively attracting people who specialize in exploitation. Your kindness becomes a signal that broadcasts your availability for manipulation. Meanwhile, people who might respect and appreciate genuine kindness often avoid relationships with people who seem to have no boundaries because they recognize that such relationships become unhealthy and unsustainable over time. This is why strategic compassion begins with what Machiavelli called the judgment of character. Before you decide how to respond to someone's request or demand, you need to assess their intentions, their track record, and their likely response to different types of interaction. Are they asking for help from a position of genuine need, or are they demanding assistance from a position of entitlement? Have they shown appreciation for past help, or have they simply escalated their demands? Do they reciprocate in the relationship, or do they consistently take without giving? These aren't cynical calculations. They're wise assessments that allow you to direct your energy and resources toward people and situations where kindness can actually be effective rather than simply consumed. The second element involves developing what researchers call assertiveness skills, the ability to communicate your boundaries clearly, kindly, and firmly without guilt or apology. Most people who struggle with excessive kindness have never learned that you can refuse unreasonable requests while maintaining genuine care for the person making them. The key is understanding that saying no to someone's request is not the same as rejecting them as a person. You can decline to work late without criticizing your colleagues' planning skills. You can refuse to lend money without questioning their financial management. You can set limits on how much emotional support you provide without withdrawing your friendship. This requires what psychologists call differentiation, the ability to maintain your own position while remaining emotionally connected to others. It's one of the most sophisticated psychological skills you can develop, and it's absolutely essential for anyone who wants to be genuinely helpful rather than merely accommodating. Consider how this applies to specific situations. When someone consistently asks you to cover their responsibilities, strategic compassion might involve helping them once or twice while clearly communicating that this isn't sustainable long-term. When they ask again, you decline kindly but firmly, perhaps offering to help them develop better systems for managing their workload instead. When a family member repeatedly creates financial emergencies and asks for money, strategic compassion might involve offering to help them create a budget or connect them with financial counseling rather than simply providing funds that enable the pattern to continue. When a friend consistently dominates conversations with their problems but shows no interest in your life, strategic compassion might involve setting limits on how much time you spend in problem-solving mode and redirecting the relationship toward more balanced interaction. In each case, you're being more genuinely helpful than if you simply accommodated their immediate requests. You're addressing the underlying patterns rather than just treating the symptoms. But this requires the strength to tolerate their potential displeasure with your boundaries and the wisdom to recognize that their long-term growth serves everyone better than their short-term comfort. The third element of strategic compassion involves what Machiavelli called strategic distance, the ability to maintain enough emotional and psychological space to make clear decisions rather than reactive ones. When you're too emotionally invested in others' approval, you can't assess situations objectively. You become prone to manipulation because your emotional need makes you vulnerable to anyone who threatens to withdraw their approval. This doesn't mean becoming cold or disconnected. It means developing what researchers call secure attachment, the ability to care deeply about others while maintaining your own center of gravity. You can be genuinely concerned about someone's well-being without making their well-being more important than your own legitimate needs and boundaries. This psychological stance allows you to be helpful when help is genuinely called for and firm when firmness is what the situation requires. You're not constantly calculating how your actions will affect others' opinion of you because your sense of worth comes from internal sources rather than external validation. The research on this is compelling. People who maintain secure attachment patterns in relationships report higher satisfaction, less stress, and more successful outcomes in both personal and professional contexts. They're able to be generous without being exploited, caring without being consumed, and helpful without enabling destructive patterns. But perhaps most importantly, they're actually more effective at helping others because their help comes from genuine strength rather than weakness. When you help someone from a position of security and choice, your assistance empowers them. When you help someone from a position of fear and compulsion, your assistance often creates dependency and resentment. Strategic compassion isn't about keeping score or withholding kindness. It's about being wise enough to direct your kindness where it can be most effective and sustainable. It's about understanding that the highest form of love sometimes requires you to risk being temporarily disliked in service of what truly serves everyone's growth and development. As we prepare to explore specific techniques for implementing this more sophisticated approach to human relationships, consider this. What would become possible in your life if you could be genuinely helpful without being consistently taken advantage of? What would change if you could care deeply about others while maintaining appropriate boundaries? What kind of person could you become if your kindness flowed from strength rather than fear? Remember to subscribe to this channel if you're finding value in these deeper explorations of human psychology. We examine the uncomfortable truths that most people prefer to avoid, and you'll want to stay connected as we continue this work together. The goal isn't to become calculating or manipulative yourself. It's to become wise enough to recognize the difference between genuine need and entitled demand, between helping and enabling, between kindness that empowers and kindness that weakens. This wisdom is what allows truly strong people to be genuinely kind in ways that actually serve the world. Now we arrive at the practical heart of this transformation: how to implement strategic compassion in your daily life without becoming the cold, calculating person you may fear you'll become. Because here's what most people miss when they first encounter these ideas: the goal isn't to become cruel or selfish. The goal is to become strong enough to be genuinely kind in ways that actually serve everyone's highest interests, including your own. The foundation of this transformation lies in what psychologists call boundary architecture, the systematic development of personal limits that protect your capacity to contribute meaningfully while preventing others from exploiting your generosity. But these aren't walls designed to keep people out. They're more like the banks of a river that give your kindness direction and power rather than allowing it to dissipate ineffectively across a flood plain. Machiavelli understood this principle when he wrote about the importance of what he called organized virtue. He observed that good intentions without strategic thinking consistently fail to achieve their objectives, while strategic thinking combined with genuine virtue becomes a force that can transform entire societies. In your personal life, this translates to kindness that is deliberate, sustainable, and actually effective rather than merely responsive to others' immediate demands. The first practical step involves developing what researchers call response flexibility. This means creating space between someone's request and your answer, allowing yourself time to consider whether saying yes serves everyone's long-term interests or simply avoids short-term discomfort. Most people who struggle with excessive kindness respond immediately to requests, often saying yes before they've even fully processed what's being asked of them. This automatic response comes from their nervous system's fear of conflict or disapproval, not from any rational assessment of the situation. The intervention is surprisingly simple. Train yourself to respond to requests with phrases like, "Let me check my schedule and get back to you," or "I need to think about that before I commit," or "Give me until tomorrow to consider whether I can help with that." This creates psychological space for wisdom rather than fear to drive your decision-making process. During this pause, ask yourself 3 crucial questions. First, Does this request align with my genuine priorities and values, or am I being asked to abandon something important to me? Second, is helping in this way likely to genuinely benefit this person's growth and development, or am I being asked to enable a pattern that ultimately serves no one? Third, do I have the actual capacity to help effectively without compromising my own well-being or responsibilities? These questions shift your focus from, how can I avoid this person's displeasure, to, how can I respond in a way that serves everyone's highest interests? This is the difference between reactive kindness and strategic compassion. The second practical step involves learning what psychologists call graduated boundary enforcement. Most people who have lived with poor boundaries imagine that setting limits means having dramatic confrontations or delivering harsh ultimatums. In reality, effective boundary setting is usually calm, clear, and matter-of-fact. Start with low-stakes situations where the consequences of boundary setting are minimal. If a colleague asks you to cover their lunch shift for the third time this month, practice saying, "I can't help with that today, but I hope you find someone who can." If a friend asks you to listen to their relationship problems during a time you've set aside for your own work, practice saying, "I care about what you're going through, but I'm not available to talk right now. Can we schedule a time later this week?" Notice that these responses acknowledge the other person's need without making it your emergency. You're not explaining, justifying, or apologizing for having your own priorities. You're simply stating what you can and cannot do, leaving the other person responsible for managing their own reaction to your limits. As you practice this in small situations, you'll develop what researchers call boundary confidence, the internal sense that you have the right to prioritize your own legitimate needs and that others' disappointment with your limits is not your responsibility to manage. The third step involves developing what Machiavelli would have called diagnostic skills, the ability to quickly assess whether someone is approaching you with genuine need or sophisticated manipulation. This isn't about becoming paranoid, but about becoming realistic about the full spectrum of human behavior and adjusting your response accordingly. People with genuine needs tend to be specific about what they're asking for, realistic about what they can offer in return, and gracious when you can't help. People with manipulative intentions tend to be vague about what they want, entitled about what you should provide, and guilt-inducing when you set boundaries. Someone with a genuine need might say, "I'm struggling with this project and could really use your expertise. I know you're busy, so even 30 minutes would be incredibly helpful, and I'd be happy to buy you lunch to thank you for your time." Someone with manipulative intentions might say, "I can't believe you won't help me with this. I thought we were friends. I guess I know where I stand with you." Learning to recognize these different approaches allows you to calibrate your response appropriately. Genuine need deserves genuine consideration. Manipulative demands deserve firm boundaries without guilt or extensive explanation. The fourth step involves what I call strategic generosity, deliberately choosing when and how to be helpful based on where your kindness can be most effective rather than simply responding to whoever makes the loudest demands on your attention. Instead of being passively available to anyone who asks for help, become actively generous toward people and causes that align with your values and where your contribution can make a meaningful difference. This might mean volunteering for organizations you care about while saying no to random requests from acquaintances. It might mean investing significant time in helping a colleague who shows genuine appreciation while declining to repeatedly bail out someone who takes your help for granted. This approach ensures that your kindness is sustainable and effective rather than simply reactive. You're directing your energy toward situations where it can compound and create positive change rather than being constantly drained by people who mistake your generosity for availability. The fifth and perhaps most important step involves developing what researchers call internal validation systems, The ability to feel good about your choices based on whether they align with your values rather than whether they produce others' approval. This requires regularly reflecting on questions like, am I proud of how I'm showing up in my relationships? Are my actions aligned with what I genuinely believe serves everyone's highest good? Am I maintaining my capacity to be helpful over the long term, or am I burning myself out trying to please everyone in the short term? When your sense of worth comes from internal rather than external sources, you can make decisions based on wisdom rather than fear. You can risk others' temporary displeasure when doing so serves a greater good. You can be genuinely kind because you choose to be, not because you're afraid of what happens if you're not. But here's what makes this transformation genuinely powerful rather than merely self-protective. As you develop these capabilities, you actually become more effective at helping others, not less. When your kindness comes from choice rather than compulsion, when your generosity flows from abundance rather than deficit, when your care is strategic rather than reactive, you can contribute to others' lives in ways that actually empower them rather than enabling their dysfunction. People begin to respect your boundaries because you've demonstrated that you have them. They value your help more because it's not automatically available. They grow from their interactions with you because you're strong enough to tell them what they need to hear rather than just what they want to hear. The ultimate irony is that learning to be appropriately selfish, to prioritize your own legitimate needs and maintain your own boundaries, makes you capable of being more genuinely generous than you ever were when you tried to please everyone. You can give from overflow rather than deficit, from strength rather than weakness, from choice rather than compulsion. As we conclude this exploration of Machiavelli's harsh truth about kindness, remember that the goal isn't to become someone who never helps others or who calculates every interaction. The goal is to become someone whose kindness is wise, sustainable, and actually effective rather than simply accommodating. Your capacity to contribute meaningfully to the world depends not on your willingness to say yes to everything, but on your wisdom to know when yes serves everyone and when no is the more genuinely loving response. This discernment, this ability to be strategically compassionate, is what separates those who make a real difference from those who simply make themselves available to be used. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel for more explorations of these uncomfortable but essential truths about human psychology. The path to genuine strength requires facing realities that most people prefer to avoid, and you'll want to stay connected as we continue this journey together. The harsh truth Machiavelli understood is that in a world where some people will exploit unconditional kindness, your refusal to develop appropriate boundaries doesn't make you more virtuous. It makes you less effective at serving what you actually care about. True kindness requires the strength to risk being disliked in service of what genuinely helps others grow, develop, and thrive. This strength, paradoxically, is what makes authentic love possible.